And probably the microphone too, I guess.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't think you need the microphone.
Yeah, it's a recording.
Recording purposes.
Hold on.
Yeah, I'm not going too far here. It's like pulling the Christmas tree over. Maybe.
All right.
That's good. Okay.
Ready when you are.
Okay, all right. That's good. Well, I feel like Ed McMahon introducing Johnny for the last time because, unfortunately, John Hoogakker will be leaving us on June 24th. He's going to take a new position up in Massachusetts on July 1st, but I'm going to let him tell you some of his exciting plans come July. But John has been here since 1985 and has really, I think we can say that we really appreciate all of the work that he and his staff have done for this building. He's had a lot of responsibility here. He came originally from Chicago with an undergraduate degree from North Park, and then did his graduate work at VCU in planning and architectural history. So this fits beautifully. He's worked with various institutions, including hospitals, and done some consulting work. So he's got an interesting variety in his background, which came together nicely here, and I think we'll be doing some interesting things up in Massachusetts with it. Today's talk is on the architectural history of UR, and I think it's going to be very interesting. We heard very good reports from the presentation of the faculty club, which several of us unfortunately had to miss, and John just this past weekend gave the presentation to a group of alumni, which was very much appreciated by them, being interested in UR's history. So without further ado, I'll turn it over and we'll have an interesting morning.
Thank you, Judith. As characteristic of people who've spent a lot of time in the Northeast, I think that the only place to leave where you are is to go to the Northeast. I'm going to Michigan. not known as the Northeast, sometimes known as the Great Frozen North. And I'm going to be joining the staff at an institution called the Cranbrook Educational Community that some of you may have heard of. It's an interesting opportunity. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about it in a little while. But what we're really here to do is talk about UR and to develop a particular notion that I think most of you have, and that notion is that there's something special architecturally about this institution. And almost everybody has that notion, and it comes from an intuitive sense of the quality of the environment as you walk around. And what I'm going to try to do today is attach some intellectual information to your intuitive sense on the quality of the environment, so you know not only intuitively that it's special, but you know intellectually why that is so. And my format is very, very casual, and in fact the best part about this, as I've gone around and done it from time to time, is that I come out of each session knowing a lot more than I did when I went in, if I can encourage a certain amount of interplay. Or what I always find out is there's a lot of anecdotal information in the room. Anybody who's interested in UR brings to the session with their interest something that they know about the institution that a lot of other people don't. Sometimes it's important historical fact, sometimes it's humorous anecdote, which I enjoy even more. So in connection with some of the subjects we're going to talk about, I'd really like you to get in and mix it up and challenge some of the things that I'm going to say, if in fact they need to be challenged, and certainly amplify or augment them if you're inclined, because that's part of the fun of the process. The other thing that's very important for me to do before I start this is some acknowledgments, because this is not original scholarship on my part by any means, but is bits and snatches that I've come across in my 7 or so years here. And the folks that I'm quickest to acknowledge are Stuart Wheeler from the Classics Department, who himself has done a fair amount of scholarship on this subject. The folks, the university archivists that are part of the Virginia Baptist Historical Society, And most important to you is your own library staff, because I've come here on many occasions. Jim Broyles, who's in the back of the room, has bailed me out on a couple of key images that I needed to, to fill out this program. Came across a wonderful document. I'll show you a couple of renderings from something that was in your own open collection that, that a lot of people around would really love to get their hands on. But our perspective today is historical. What did I do? Now I made it mad, didn't I? Can I turn this off or on or anything from here? Or do we just lose a lamp?
Yeah, I don't think we lost the lamp to make it, that thing's kind of funny. Hang on just a second.
Okay. Our perspective is historical. The nice thing about this is that I don't have to talk over projector noise. The not so nice thing about it is at the last minute all of my slides had to be turned around 180 degrees. and I can assure you that I am personally incapable of getting 40 or 50 slides in all the same way. So I had somebody help me put them in the first time. and I'm now relying on the fact that my good help here has helped to get them turned around. Oh, we've got fade and everything here, huh? Okay. By technology. But we'll go with that.
That's good, yes.
All right. Hey, good help back there. Thanks. Our perspective is a historical one. We're not going to spend any significant time, unless it's anecdotally, on some fairly dull years between about 1935 and 1980. But what we're going to talk about is the genesis of this particular property or this particular campus, a little bit about why it is and about how it got to be there. And as you can see, this is a cover from the Cornerstone Laying program, June 10th of 1913. The ceremony was to commemorate the cornerstone laying for the whole new campus, and particularly of Ryland Hall. So now I'll drop back to my notes a minute and try to catch up with where I ought to be. We're going to look at an architectural movement. We're going to look at one of the champions of that architectural movement, who as a personality is really central to our discussion. We're going to glimpse an architectural commission, which in this case is for a complete new college, and some of the details of that commission, and typified in one of the buildings. It's just to narrow our focus a little bit. The movement is a latter Gothic revival. The champion is Ralph Adams Crams, which is a name that you should try to remember. The commission is for Richmond College, and the particular building is Ryland Hall, the original academic and administrative building. The latter Gothic revival had some very profound effects on institutional and ecclesiastical architecture in the United States. This period in the early 20th century saw such buildings assuming forms more and more reminiscent of medieval Europe, and particularly of England. This is a highly picturesque style which evoked what one of the movement's champions called racial memories, curious enough, even in Americans. The champion I refer to is Ralph Adams Crams, whose picture you see, a self-proclaimed medievalist who eschewed modern society completely as conspiring to deprive man of his nobility. Crams was born in New Hampshire in 1863, the son of a Universalist minister. He was educated at Yale and ultimately collaborated with Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue to execute Goodhue's successful entry in the design competition for buildings at the United States Military Academy. And this happens to be Goodhue's pencil rendering of the West Point Chapel. And the building exists essentially exactly as you see it today. There's going to be a striking correlation in this presentation between architectural rendering in advance of the construction of an actual project and the image of that project after construction. Much more correlation between the envisioning of a rendering and the execution of a commission than we typically find in architecture today. For example, we publish widely a rendering of Ryland Hall, which was done in the planning process, which in some substantial details, not in massing, but in some substantial details, differs from the reality of that building. But the way that these folks envisioned these commissions was apparently a much stronger feeling, a much stronger image. It was more likely to be carried out. As a consequence of this and other successful academic commissions, their collaboration caused them to be named as supervising architect at Princeton University. And some of you may recognize this as the graduate school, which is one of Crams' several commissions there. If this building bears a striking resemblance to something you're familiar with on campus, that is not a coincidence. Because I can tell you that if you can see that laser, this area of the graduate quadrangle at Princeton is yet today called North Court. In 1900, Cram married Elizabeth Carrington Reed of Farmville, Virginia, established some familial ties with this part of the country that were undoubtedly instrumental in gaining some future commissions. Throughout his career, Cram was influential on church architecture in particular. And in the year 1911, he began an association which was ultimately to become his master work. The Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City was originally conceived in the mid-19th century as a Romanesque edifice, but had languished for lack of funds for several decades. In 1911, Cram began to redesign the cathedral in the Gothic style, in a rather French Gothic style. And the process of design and construction of this building were to occupy him for the rest of his life, another 31 years approximately. And some of you may know that the building is not yet complete today. This again is one of the wonderful architectural renderings that those people were capable of. Not only architecturally accurate and suggestive of architectural style, but somehow emotionally evocative. But more interesting yet, to give you some idea of the real scale of Cram's masterpiece, I can tell you now that we're looking at a rendering for the west elevation, and this comes out of your library collection in a large folio that was published as part of the fundraising efforts to maintain the momentum on this project back through the 1920s. Chairman of the building committee at the time was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who went to exhaustive pains to produce a beautiful basically a fundraising brochure, which is a big folio, which you have here. But I digress, because this is a west elevation. But to understand the true scope of this project and this commission, I would say that that is the ultimate plan, which is nearing completion now for the building. And the west elevation that we looked at are those two small towers. Okay, so that'll give you an idea of what was involved in construction of this edifice. The Roosevelt's notes say very consciously the building is larger than Notre Dame, the building is larger than Chartres. It is intended to be the American ecclesiastical icon. Okay, it is exceeded in size only by St. Peter's and Seville. It was intended in the robust days of American nationalism in the 20s to make a statement about what was capable in this country relative to what were considered the European icons of ecclesiastical architecture. Being what some people might call a reactionary thinker, and hearkening back to this medieval golden age of humanity, as Cram called it, it's hard to believe today that as a major figure in the 20th century, he advocated reunification of all Christians in a universal Catholic Church. and that he advocated a form of American monarchy wherein the American leader would serve a lifelong term after selection by the governors of the several states. And this is a mainline thinker in the 20th century. In connection with some of these ideas on history, art, political philosophy, science, he authored some 28 books with titles including The Gothic Quest, The Ministry of Art, The Nemesis of Mediocrity, The Great Thousand Years, meaning what the rest of us call the Dark Ages, and undoubtedly Ralph's own favorite, My Life in Architecture. He was ever the scholar and served as chairman of the architectural department at MIT for 7 years. In 1942, Crams' obituary in the New York Times referred to him as the savant of Sudbury when he died at his home in Sudbury, Massachusetts. It's some indication of Crams' standing in the architectural profession that in April of 1910, 4 men traveled by train from Richmond to Boston to confer with him on a prospective commission. These men included J. Taylor Ellison, then Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, and Frederick W. Boatwright, the president of Richmond College. At this conference, it was resolved that Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson being a recent partner, would plan an entire new campus for Richmond College. This would be a greater Richmond College, as they called it, relocating the current college and adding a college for women. The college would be constructed on the site of a former amusement park, which existed at the far west end of the city's electric trolley line. It was also agreed that Cram would deliver the oration at the ceremony to place the cornerstone for the new college, the program which we saw at the beginning of our slides. On that occasion, he said, and I quote, "Here at Richmond College, what we are trying to do is abandon all that is ephemeral and time-saving in architecture and go back to that perfect style which was developed by our own kin in the old home overseas to express just these high and eternal ideas of education that were so perfectly calculated to breed character and did in fact breed high character, as history clearly shows." Ralph took himself pretty seriously. He took his clients pretty seriously too, by all accounts. But in any case, Cram adamantly maintained the existence of a reciprocal relationship between human nobility and architecture. Essentially, good buildings influencing a good quality built environment, let's say, influencing better people, who would in turn create better environments, who would create better people in a spiraling evolution of human nobility. The Richmond College Commission, which we're going to look at in particular, represents a rather unique opportunity for that day to plan an entire campus from scratch. It's interesting to note its highly axial layout. It's in many ways suggestive of the Beaux-Arts tradition in planning, which was very fashionable in these days. Although it was Cram's intention never to be fashionable, but to always represent those past traditions in architecture. In fact, most of his energies for his last 2 decades were in lecturing and writing in vehement opposition to the modernist and to the internationalist movements in particular. Nevertheless, he was somewhat stylish with this very axial layout. You see these long avenues or malls around which the college buildings are grouped, and it's rather formal. But in reality, this layout is somewhat stilted or artificial within a proposed setting because it doesn't really work well with the topography. And it's also interesting to note that the year is now 1911. The West End and Huguenot Road and Carey Street in particular are thought to be perhaps the busiest vehicular intersection in the Commonwealth. And Mr. Cram nevertheless makes no concession whatsoever to the existence of the automobile. All right, there are no roads. There are not only No parking spaces, there are no roads. We are still walking around in his mind like medieval people. Okay? So when you have difficulty finding a parking space on campus, or when your visitors to the library do, you need to explain to them that that is in fact part of our planned architectural tradition. Really, there's a few concessions to modern convenience at all, save the fact that he had to deal with these trolley tracks, because the trolley tracks actually ran down and underneath where Ryland Hall is today. So the trolley turnaround was moved up into where the buses turn around now. And if you notice where the buses turn around, it's pressed into that little hillside, and it's pressed in there much harder than you would think would need to be done for a bus. Well, that was to facilitate the fact that trolleys weren't very good on grades, and they needed a rather flat area to turn around and head back to the city of Richmond. The amusement park, as an aside, in fact, that existed here was a collaboration between the trolley company, who wanted to get people to buy full fare to ride all the way to the end of the line, and a number of residential developers who were only beginning to envision the upscale residential neighborhoods in this part of the city that exist today. They wanted people to come out and see the land and to be acquainted with the opportunity to buy a home site. The trolley folks wanted to sell full fares, so jointly they developed this old farm property as an amusement park, which was never commercially successful. Well, given the shortcomings that I've mentioned in this original Cram and Ferguson master plan, invariably Warren Manning, also of Boston, was engaged to redo the college master plan. Acknowledging Cram to be the architect for the project, they nevertheless acknowledged that perhaps another master planner, someone a little bit more receptive to the realities of the 20th century, would be a good choice. And Manning was a protege of Frederick Law Olmsted and was a prominent landscapist of the day. Manning produced this 1912 plan. The plan groups the building in somewhat irregular arrangements, but arrangements which take advantage of the topography and of the natural views. And this plan indicates the much more organic style of campus organization which we experience today, and much less formal. The work of Cram and others at academic institutions had by this time earned the name Collegiate Gothic. Okay, that's a Collegiate Gothic being a small institutional subset of this latter Gothic revival. Let me tell you about the Gothic revival overall. In the mid-19th century, residential architecture began to turn towards very picturesque and highly decorated styles. And the early Gothic revival was essentially a residential movement that ran nominally from 1850 to 1890. Okay, just to generalize a bit. By this time, it was falling out of favor towards the end of Victoria's reign, as the Queen Anne's and some of the more contemporary English styles began to gain favor. But it nevertheless, in its first residential life, had begun to be picked up for church architecture, and people began to feel again sort of an intuitive affinity for Gothic architecture and their religious and their patterns of worship and so forth, and some of their ideas about worship. So the Gothic style around the turn of the century languished completely, but in the early years of the 20th century, some of these other styles that had been tried for churches and for institutional buildings, like educational buildings, have been found to be largely unpopular. And the architectural profession began to turn back to the Gothic form for those two buildings. The latter Gothic revival is picking up just as this property is being developed, and is mostly a non-residential movement. It's an institutional movement, and this return to those ideas is kind of championed by Mr. Cram to the extent that he is writing and lecturing, and to the extent that it's thought that the latter Gothic revival probably died with Mr. Cram in 1942. So that's most commonly given as a terminus date of the latter Gothic revival. Well, in any case, this subset that Cram was so involved with at Princeton, at West Point, at Richmond, and in a number of other places, Sweetbriar College in Virginia has a lot of Cram work. Rice University in Texas has some. His partner Goodhue had moved to New York to form a separate office by this time, and is doing his own commissions, including a lot of the wonderful work at the University of Chicago, most notably the chapel there. Well, this Collegiate Gothic subset is really quite fashionable in college architecture. The final building plan settled on in this Manning plan includes an initial phase of construction for 6 buildings. These would include 2 residence halls for men, the buildings that we today call Thomas Hall and Jeter Hall, a large building to accommodate the entire women's college, which we know today is North Court, a stadium structure, which we use primarily for soccer now, a power plant, and I would tell you very proudly, probably the only Gothic revival power plant with which I am familiar, and the only coal-fired power plant in the country that's clearly eligible for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places because of its association with Mr. Grant. Where was I? An academic and administration building, which we know as Ryland Hall. We're now into a number of these original pencil renderings, and I've actually had folks all much older than you and with less visual acuity ask me if we weren't in fact looking at old photographs. But these are old newspaper prints of those original renderings. This is Thomas Hall as we know it today. Although this anticipates a wing which is not completed. What we're looking at from here over is Thomas Hall, essentially as you know it, on the hill right across from where we are. You know, this is well in advance of actual design and construction, but you will all clearly recognize that as a West Hampton quadrangle and the tower at North Court. This is Ryland Hall, or as Charlie Ryland corrects me frequently, Ryland Halls, 2 buildings named for Charles and Robert Ryland that happen to be connected. Let's see, we're looking from off campus, from the homes down in the gully there up the hill. This is a section that includes, this was originally administrative and other function. This was originally academic. Okay? But again, a pretty nice rendering. And this is the other side of Ryland Hall. There's a piece here you don't recognize. What you know of Ryland Hall starts at this edge and includes this building. But if you look at that building, you will find 2 bricked-in arches. Well, actually, one is not bricked in, it's functional. On the second floor, a bricked-in arch, where it was clearly the intention that Ryland Hall would be expanded in the relatively short-term future to include the University Library. And this building is, in fact, a library that exists as a wing to Ryland. And that tower is clearly an architectural forebear of the tower, which is today the university's architectural signature. What had happened was that the most prominent site on the property had been reserved for the chapel, and that was the knoll on the Richmond College side of the lake. And that was a sort of popular choice until it came time to actually construct the chapel. And some other planning activities, strongly influenced undoubtedly by the preference of the donor, suggested that the West Hampton side be a better place for the chapel. So it was constructed there, which made, again, this very prominent place, this most central place in the whole campus available. Everyone's clear second choice for what should occupy the knoll over the lake was the library. And so this building was never in fact connected to Ryland, but was moved forward to the lakeside location. Although you'll see a lot of the feeling that was anticipated even here was still very much alive and very much discussed as late as 35 and 40 years later, when the construction of Boatwright Library was imminent. The use of the Collegiate Gothic style in the southern United States was still not universally popular. This is a regional phenomenon. It was not popular in the South. This is suggested by an exchange of correspondence, which is dated 1911. In the initial letter, a prominent Richmond College alum who is serving as a professor of law at Washington and Lee writes several pages of criticism of the selection of the Gothic style, saying among other things, and underlined that, quote, "it is not Virginian." Let's go. This is in many ways, and please ascribe this to me and not to the author of the letter, but this is in many ways to me a thinly veiled restatement of the fact that many people consider the Gothic style to be a form of what they called popery, predominantly a Catholic style of architecture. I don't know many people today who ascribe ecclesiastical significance of one form of architecture or another, but they did at the time. And there was a great deal of criticism of this choice. A substantial number of folks in this institution were not prepared to live with this style of building. But some scholarship remains to be done in terms of who was the particularly strong individual who made the commitment and followed through on it. University folklore suggests that it's Dr. Boatwright. Preliminary scholarship that I have done suggests that it is probably J. Taylor Ellison, who is then chairman of the board of trustees. The reason I suspect that is that he was widely reputed as having run roughshod over the board of trustees and the administration a few years earlier, when he led the campaign and led the board in the construction of Battle Abbey. Let's see. There's a polite but firm response to the letter that I mentioned that states, in fact, that the commitments are made, that the college will go ahead in this style. And Crams' firm now associates itself with the local office of Carneal and Johnston to act as their local representatives on construction management. And this arrangement between Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson and Carneal and Johnson is going to persist for a number of years and in a number of very special ways, one of which is very special to all of us, and it happens to be the Carolinenberg Park, which is again conceived by Cram, executed in schematic form by Cram, and actually detailed and constructed by Carneal and Johnson locally. Warren Manning, by this time, had also dispatched one of his young proteges to Richmond to supervise the site development of the university property. Charles Gillette is a name that several of you may recognize. And he came to Richmond, became rather enamored of the area, to say the least, and in fact never left, and became what most people would consider today probably the most renowned interpreter of the southern landscape. You know, I often think that if it hadn't been for Charles Gillette, there wouldn't be a Southern Living magazine, because there wouldn't be that wonderful regional variant on the garden themes that he was really the initiator of. Well, I digress in several ways. The construction in this style was extremely expensive, as you would imagine, and this soon became a real issue for the college. The cost of the initial phase of the campus approximated $900,000. That's to build the entire university, taking it from a farm to a finished campus. The contracts list suggests that the cost for the administration and academic building alone, that is Ryland Halls, is $117,000. The Bricklayer is a magazine forerunner of Architectural Forum. It published an article reviewing contemporary collegiate projects in November of 1914. Regarding Crams' work at Richmond College, they said, and I quote, "Conditions in this case, however, were different than those that existed at West Point and Princeton, in that financial means were not so ample, and that the prime consideration was to obtain as large and complete a group of buildings as possible within the funds available. This difficult condition they have met with marked success. The buildings have been built with strict regard for economy and have therefore been reduced to the simplest terms of the style. And in spite of these limiting conditions, they succeed to an unusual degree." All right, which is, you know, contemporary criticism of what was happening here. The irony of that statement in the context of today's architectural practice is to refer to any of these buildings as simple. Perhaps compared to the cathedral we looked at, this is simple architecture. But this is a form of architecture which is daunting to today's practitioners, to the folks who come out here and who we ask to try to work in that same style. In addition to relative simplicity of form, another concession involving the construction of the buildings was to use brick with limestone trim rather than the stone or what we call random ashlar masonry, which is more often identified with the style. The buildings at Princeton, whose means were more ample, as we've heard, had all of these buildings constructed of stone. It is more than a move towards economy, however. It is clearly a regional concession or a regional adaptation of the Gothic style. In the Northeast, Gothic buildings aren't brick, but the tradition of wonderful, wonderful brick construction in the Southeast is not to be taken lightly by Cram. And he produced a palette of materials and some visual interaction between brick and stone here, which says wonderful things about both his tradition in the Gothic style and about Virginia traditions in brick. Let's see. We're going to look at Ryland Hall, rather than trying to embrace all the things that were going on in connection with this project. We're going to look at Ryland Hall in particular, and that's most easy for me because we've been collecting a few good images of Ryland Hall for several months with the intention of submitting our Ryland Hall renovation project for the Historic Richmond for recognition by the Historic Richmond Foundation. So we'll move ahead to Ryland, and this is an anecdote that maybe has more significance for this group than for any other group that I have spoken to. But and please, Judith, don't let me run over my time. I really don't know how much time I have. I guess as much as you say, right? Since you're the librarian.
History.
When I came here, my interest in architectural history and my interest in my professional experience as a preservationist and restorationist were really key to my decision to come to this institution, the opportunity to work in restoration and preservation. When I got here, I found an absolutely abysmal archive of principal documents. The paper copies of original plans, which the university or the college had acquired in the process of building the buildings, had long since torn themselves to pieces and built coffee spilled on them, and all of the horror stories of any good archivist. The files were notably lacking in terms of historical document, and I said, well, sure, we want the question of what next for the old buildings was easy for me to answer. And I said, let's not try to make these buildings step ahead in time, which was something that had happened here in the 70s. let's agree philosophically that it's time for the buildings to step back in time. And the right way to do that is with a scrupulous attention to the original documents of how the buildings were constructed, except the documents didn't exist. Cram and his associates were long since dead. Their office is long since closed. But with a little bit of scholarship, a little bit of persistence, and a lot of dumb luck, we followed a trail through successive firms, through a few old folks that were still alive, and were led to believe that the Boston City Library might be helpful to us. And I talked to the archivist for the Boston City Library, who said, who could only acknowledge the possibility that they had something. There was nothing cataloged. But he said that the library had acquired a few things over the years that it had not been scrupulous in documenting or cataloging. And when I said, would it be worth coming to Boston to look through these few things to see if there's one or two pieces of interest, he allowed us how that might be a prudent move. Well, I was desperate to go on that trip, but it conflicted with some Board of Trustees activities and some things at UR, and reluctantly I acknowledged that I couldn't go, and sent Randy Darnell, who many of you know from our staff. And Mr. Sinclair Hitchings is himself a feature of the archives in the Boston City Library. And what I remember is number one, Randy telling me about walking down the streets of Boston when it was 9 below zero. And number two, that memorable experience is when he called me from Boston to say that he was up in the upper reaches of the library, and it was absolutely unbelievable because everything was there. By acquiring a few things that they hadn't cataloged, Mr. Hitchings meant an area which in total was about half the size of this floor, piled with baled architectural documents, just tied with strings. They in fact had about 280 or 290 original architectural documents on the construction of the University of Richmond. And the excitement when he told me that we had found it, that we had access to it, is just one of those things that I'll always remember about my association with the University of Richmond. And they're very stubborn about those documents. They are drawn on linen in black ink, as was the custom of the day. And they are each and every one individual works of art, which the Boston City Library is not much inclined to let us remove from their collection. But they were very gracious and bent the rules a little bit to allow Randy on that visit and on a couple more subsequent visits to leave the library for a period of hours to take the documents to a place where we could have Mylars made. And today we treat those, we revere those Mylars as if they were real linen documents. And they are the yardstick by which we measure the success of everything that we do in preservation and restoration. And I have just a couple of pictures of these documents on Ryland Hall. And yeah, okay, we got that right. That's one of the elevation drawings. Here's another. You can see how the linen is foxing along the edges. Is that not exactly the building you know today? Is it not remarkable that 80 years later, there is no substantial difference between the original intent and the reality that we live with on a day-to-day basis? There's some of the detailing associated with some stonework and some of these simple massing studies. There's some detailing. The center line of that gable marks a change in perspective from the outside of the building, where you see the stone niche and the lancet work in the windows, to the interior where you see detailings for the window frames and the paneling. These are wonderful old documents to deal with on a daily basis. This is, let me again say that is the plan, that is the window. And this is an archival photograph of the way that building was originally completed. This, in intent, was the central lecture hall for the college. But in reality, with their inability to complete that early library wing that we looked at, this is in fact the first Richmond College library on this site, with all of with shelves ultimately developed. And you can see some books back in these little nooks. And as you know, it's also today the home of the senior faculty in the English department. Again, the plan, okay, the entry facing what the building we now call PSMS. The 1913, in this case, 1912 conception, and the 1992 reality. Okay, this, you know, the name of their relationship is identity. It's a wonderful building, as you can, and I'm enthusiastic about Ryland Hall, as you can tell. The cloisters, the tracery, the stone grotesques, they're all elements of Crams' architectural signature. Looking at some more detail and some more of the way that the building is organized. There's so much anecdotal information on this building alone. You can tell that even the roofers got artistic. If you look at the way that they decided to sort their slates for a while, until somebody who didn't like that idea got after them. That happened a couple places on campus. This is a hard shot to get because of the way that the construction at Jepson intrudes on Ryland just now. That's the bell tower without the bell. That was intended to house the bell that came from the old campus downtown. But a couple of days in advance of actually relocating the bell, Dr. Boatwright reminded of the countless times that student pranksters had aroused the campus in the middle of the night by ringing that bell. Finally let his emotions probably overrule his pragmatic sense and said, no, by golly, if I'm the president, we're not going to have a bell. And notwithstanding that his office was connected to it was in the bottom of that tower and connected to the tower with a rope chase by which only he could ring the bell when he wanted to. The bell rope being locked behind the door in his office. Notwithstanding all those precautions that he had already taken in architectural planning, he just finally decided that there just wouldn't be a bell. We just didn't need one. So it is the empty tower. As you wonder what that is, that'll shed a little light on that question for you.
Do you know what did happen to the bell?
The bell was last seen, well, I should tell you that recently we have made exhaustive efforts to find that bell because we wanted to, we considered hanging it in the restoration of the building, but we wanted to use it as a landscape feature, at least in the new quadrangle to be developed there. It was last seen at a homecoming bonfire about 1937 or 1938. The students had succeeded in pirating it from its storage place and removed it to the scene of where they had their homecoming festivities, and apparently it never got back where it belonged. So it has probably been through several antique shops by now. Again, just as an aside, this is interesting technology for the time because it is a very early effort at what we now call cast rather than carved limestone. All right, this is sort of the chicken McNuggets of the limestone world, where the stuff is actually kind of granulated and liquefied and placed in molds. Actually, rather than work with stone carvers, wood carvers and soft wood created the molds by which most of these forms were made. And today that process has become so expensive that all of our stonework is real Indiana limestone, is carved stone. But in the early days of experimental cast stone, this is a fairly notable project. You may notice some of these stone niches that are absent of their statuary. undoubtedly has something to do with this potpourri concern that we talked about before. But in his work at Yale University, the architect James Gamble Rogers explained that the absence of this statuary suggested the effects of barbarian raids on Gothic buildings. Well, I find that logic somewhat circuitous, but at what is today called the University of Richmond, when we think about the denominational affiliations of the institution, we have taken to calling this phenomenon Baptist iconography.
Are there going to be any statues in the niches that are in the new building?
No, not unless it's Mr. Judson.
I thought maybe that's what they were.
No, we've only joked about that. There is a tradition of empty niches in this form of architecture. The example of Ryland Hall we're really using to illustrate an important tenet of Crams' work. He said that design should not reveal itself at once or from any particular spot, but gradually, through narrowed and intensified vistas, through the unforeseen opening out of unanticipated paths and quadrangles. You should experience the surprise of retirement and the revelation of the unexpected. And it's true, and it's clever, that in all good buildings in this form, you cannot assume a perspective anywhere, one perspective anywhere, and understand what's happening with the building, understand how it's organized, how it works, how it's detailed. Form follows function is anathema to this form. To be able to look at a building and say that it's a dairy because it's shaped like a milk bottle, is completely foreign to this concept. The idea is that you live with the building and you travel through it and you feel it in all of its different permutations before you begin to understand it. One particularly engaging aspect of Ryland in this sense is sort of a, well, let's look at some images first. This is one of my favorites of Ryland, that cloister. This is wonderfully quiet. Here's a couple slides which will illustrate some of the subtlety to be accomplished in using brick, and one of the experimental aspects of Crams' work. This brick is now known throughout the Southeast as UR blend. So many people who were going to build a home or build an office building went to their brick company and said, I want the brick that they use at the University of Richmond. That all of the brickyards now make an order called UR blend. And if you simply tell your brickman you want UR blend, he'll give you a certain number of charcoals, a certain number of burgundies, a certain number of oranges, and a certain number of reds, which when they're combined will have this effect. And one of the magic things about this is that the building in shadow can be stoic and somber, and the building in sun can be toasty and warm and inviting. It's part of the schizophrenia of Gothic architecture. Couldn't decide which way it wants to be, and in fact it can be either in so many ways.
Was the brick manufactured here in Virginia?
Yes, and that's still the case for Jefferson as well. We found probably the samples we liked best to come from one of the two Virginia-owned and operated brickyards that are still in existence. That's another view of some of that detail. There's some. I've certainly met folks who claim to recognize historic personages in those grotesques. In fact, over on Brunet Hall, a lot of people will ignore chronology and vehemently assert that you see Dr. Maudlin over the main entrance, even though he wasn't on the scene until 30 years after. More recent work more recent work that we've done over there with the firm of Wright, Cox and Smith includes a female figure over the new entrance to what was the Women's Resource Center. A lady architect who worked very hard on that project suffers a great deal of professional embarrassment over the fact that I really believe, incidentally, that woman that stone figure bears a striking resemblance to her. She would have us believe, and I'm inclined to give her the benefit of the doubt and say that it's subconscious. The landscape has matured beautifully in the 80 years, as you can see. The Gillette work there, the Gillette work on campus is astounding. This slide is really only intended to suggest how eclectic these buildings are and how eclectic the construction of them is. Intersections of odd angles and elliptical arches and roof planes outside that window, and then square traditional forms in the window itself are again daunting to people like plasterers and carpenters. Especially the plasterers and carpenters of today, who under pressure can replicate a 45-degree angle.
With help. This is one of our newest, oldest classrooms. Again, the idea of what to do with these buildings was to step back. There was a flurry of activity after the Robbins gift in the 70s to bring all of the university buildings, quote, up to date. We're going to do things. We're going to make these rooms work better acoustically. We're going to outfit them with better academic equipment. We're going to air condition it. We're going to air condition these old buildings. And in effect, the university raced out, and with in a flurry that was less than sensitive to the architecture, really massacred a lot of the interiors. Doing in what they called in that day modernization, which is pretty bad. But they wanted it to happen quick, and they wanted to do it cost effectively, and they did. And that was the philosophy of the day, and my predecessors did a good job in fulfilling that philosophical mission. But they were rather inexpensive finishes in the 70s, and by the mid-80s they were shot. And it's 1985, and I got here, and the question is, what's next? What do we do now? And being a preservationist and a restorationist, I said, I know. let's turn back the clock. And so those pretty awful 1970s classrooms became these 1990s classrooms that look a lot more like, the teens and 20s than anything we've seen over there lately. As a colleague of mine says, calls this the classroom where the blackboards are black and the baseboards are boards. Rather than having the optical green writing surface and a roll-out vinyl base. So this is a class of the mechanical systems are hidden in the casework under the windows. Generations of paint were removed from the stone window frames. Piping was reorganized so that the ceilings could be pushed back up. Rather than buy new classroom furniture, we scoured the countryside and found enough old classroom furniture to refinish the chairs and produce laminate tablet arms for them that are more resistant to carving. And have created numerous classroom environments over there that we feel have been responded to very positively by the academic community, both in terms of the people who teach there and the people who learn there. They get a very traditional sense from the room. They get a sense of the seriousness of what they're about when they're in that room. They get the sense that for those who had fathers or mothers or grandmothers who went here, the sense of continuity and the way that they experienced the building. And this is, I hope that the next slide is, yes, another view from the same classroom. And this, I want to harken back now to that quote from Cram about how you should experience the building, and the way that this building has a sort of a curious
narcissism about it almost, because in so many places it sort of turns and looks back at itself and gives you appreciation, an opportunity to appreciate where you've been or maybe where you're going, and creates a unique interplay between building exteriors and exteriors. That is something, again, we don't often feel in modern architectural context, right? I mean, we try to bring landscape into the building sometimes in the way we pursue architecture today, but we very rarely try to bring the exterior of the building we're in into that building's own interior. And that sort of thing happens continuously throughout Rhode Island because of all of its turns and perpendicular axes. Yes, Paul?
I've got a question. In the renovation process of Rhode Island Hall and the way you're explaining and what you were concerned about and making it look like it was in the past, was that, obviously that was shared by other persons, like the Board of Trustees? I mean, what does that go through? How did the machinations of what that went through, in other words, to come up with that scheme, rather than just going in there and redoing it, but making it modern, having, internal being modern and exterior being Gothic?
Well, in the process of being selected for my role at the university, my philosophy on these things was fathomed very carefully by administrative leaders and by trustees. And it was understood that if I were to come to work at this property, that I would be expected to champion the values of restoration and renovation. And I was both shocked and gratified by the effect, by the way that which my own particular prejudices were received. All right, I expected a little tougher sledding in many ways, but at that time I wasn't known, or I wasn't well aware of the precedents whereby past presidents of the university, George Maudlin in particular, tells a story about the way that he as president was held to very few strictures in the way that he administered the university during his tenure. The first was financial integrity, or first was academic integrity. The second was sound financial practice, and the third was steadfast commitment to the Gothic style of architecture. And I found when I got here, in George and others who remembered the glory days of these old buildings, very friendly spirits in connection with my ideas that we might go backwards rather than ahead. Does that answer your question?
So we could expect that would continue to be the mindset?
You may. Dr. Heilman was the first president sworn in without that particular stricture, and based on our experience, on our institutional experience with his tenure, that stricture was reinstated for Dr. Morrill. The institution clearly drifted into some infatuations with postmodernism, in the 70s, which now a lot of folks wish could be undone. But it's even temporary buildings are often impossible to dispose of. Much less permanent buildings built in an inappropriate style. This institution contrasts so drastically with an institution like Yale, for example, where you read the institution like tree rings, like concentric rings in a tree, where there's some sort of vernacular colonial core, frequently Georgian or English in some way, and then given their infatuations with being stylish, there's a ring of Gothic buildings around those, there's a ring of international buildings around those, and a ring of postmodern buildings around those. So as a student of architectural history, it's an interesting experience to walk through that campus. But as a layperson, open to the influences of the architecture and of the built environment, it sends very confusing signals and lacks the consistency to which this institution has continually subscribed. Really, I can offer just a couple of other notes about these buildings. We're very close to wrapping up. Here's some more images. There's another way in which the interiors and the exteriors interplay. and how something else you don't often think of today, the selection of colors and palettes of materials for the interiors and the way that they need to complement the exteriors. There's some interesting compromises in there between modern necessity for air conditioning, piping, and so forth, and aesthetic effect, and those little plaster teardrop soffits that, you know, when we took on this project, this ceiling was down about this level and simply cut off the top of all those windows. That's a contemporary view of the slide that you saw earlier. That's not shabby quarters for faculty, is it? I tell campus visitors that this is where Mr. Pips used to work, or Mr. Chips, I'm sorry. Pips is a potato chip guy, right? As something as mundane as a stairway landing can still be such an important part of experiencing the building. The 1970s saw these wonderful old commons rooms and rooms for literary societies in the upper floor get wiped out and offices introduced into that floor along what we would call the double-loaded corridor. A 2x4 acoustical ceiling about like this one dropped in at about 7'10" across the corridor. And my good friend Dr. Bob Carter, who's the historian for the Virginia Historic Landmark Commission, came out and before, as we began planning the renovation, and made a very profound comment. He said the building is so disappointing inside. He said the exterior is so highly featured, but the interior has become so featureless. That we keyed on some of his thoughts there and tried to find a few motifs or feature ideas that we could reintroduce into the building, and the Gothic arch, which is so prominent in those exterior arcades, became a motif that we used in redeveloping these corridors with compound arches and then replicas of 1910 schoolhouse light fixtures, which are true to the feeling of the era when the building was built. There's an old piece of attic that's been developed into a seminar room that's pretty popular for small classes. The last couple of notes that I have on the history of these buildings really involve, first of all, the financial burden which was developing on the campus at the time in these early years. It was really a matter of pragmatism as well as patriotism when the U.S. government requested the use of these buildings as an entire new campus at the outbreak of World War I. In 1918, the college returned to its old, still unsold quarters downtown on a temporary basis so that these new buildings could be used as a base hospital for injured servicemen returning from the front. The government offered the staggering rent of $150,000 per year, and that was good enough. That made a pretty good dent in the $900,000 tab that had been assumed a few years before. But it's interesting because it's really the deaths of some of these servicemen after periods of protracted agony resulting from their war injuries or their poison gas experiences and so forth. It's the deaths of these men that really account for the ghost stories that persist in connection with a lot of these buildings. Okay. Another interesting point that you already know from things I've said is that the university has recently expended about $1.1 million on the restoration and renovation work at Ryland in particular. That process will really be complete when we remove the last of the air conditioning equipment that's standing along the outside wall of the building when Ryland is connected to the air conditioning plant at Jepson. So really within a few weeks we will have completed what we call the restoration process. And this will really assure the aesthetic and the programmatic vitality of the building for the foreseeable future. One final anecdote about Cram, about his outlook, about his ego, and about his work at the University of Richmond. My counterpart at Princeton is a good friend of several years, and I visited that campus recently, and we walked over to the chapel. And we were searching the stone ornamentation on the building until we found, obscured in this elaborate stone detail, a representation of the Yale Bulldog in the wall of the Princeton Chapel. And this we knew it was there, and we knew that this was a small vanity indulged in by Mr. Cram when he designed that building. Well, shortly afterwards, I'm walking across campus and I'm near Ryland Hall, and I notice on the side facing the PSMS building, and I'm sorry I don't have a slide, but I'll get one and I'll put it in this program, that in the decorative stone bosses along the band of the building, there's a highly stylized shield, and within the shield are carved the letters RC. And I thought for a minute, and I was absolutely sure that Dick Mateer would tell you that RC stood for Richmond College. But based on my experience at Princeton, I'm not so sure about that at all. That concludes the images that I brought with me today, and most of my remarks, except so far as you want to ask questions or discuss anything we've looked at.
Is there any further projected renovation and restoration anywhere else on campus?
Yes, I'm very happy to report that in 1987, we began the systematic restoration of all the original buildings. And they have all been complete now with the exception of the academic portion of North Court, which will be completed in 1993. One of the goals that I set for myself during my tenure at UR was the restoration of all of those, and I think I'm close enough now having that planned and budgeted and scheduled so that I'm feeling like I've fulfilled my own mandate in that regard. So yes, those original buildings will all be back in top shape.
Could you say a word about landscaping on the campus? The fact that there was a Olmsted protege connected with this.
Well, the Olmsted protege was Manning. Manning sent Gillette, who was ultimately, particularly in this part of the country, to become much more prominent and well known than Manning himself ever was. For those of you who walk the campus, if you will visit the old tea garden behind Keller Hall, if you haven't been, in where the tea room was, there's a fish pond, there's a little goldfish pond to which we've only recently reintroduced goldfish. And it's a stunning piece of landscape. The quadrangle within the residential wings of North Court is a very quaint place. Unfortunately, a few years ago when we renovated that building, a lot of Gillette's plants had simply become too big. Some of them prospered there beyond his expectations. It had grown to mature sizes that he hadn't anticipated. They were causing problems with views from the building. There were problems with the gutters on the building. And so we had to scale back to some smaller specimens and basically reestablished what we call the second generation of the Gillette plan. You know, son of Gillette, something like that. The Deanery Garden, he developed the garden behind the building we know as a deanery, to the effect that it's probably one of the most popular wedding venues in Richmond. If you haven't attended a wedding in the pergola behind the deanery, or haven't just walked through, you really should. It's 4 weeks ago. It was a splendid experience, with most of the blossoms being out. But Gillette was good at planning for continual color, so there's usually something coming along there at all different times of year. And then the other issues, Judith, are really master planning. How a lot of people think that some of these hills were always here, but there was really massive efforts to reshape the topography in some significant ways. So everything from the master planning of the big earth forms down to tiny planting details. Gillette specified, and in fact, all of the original landscape material was delivered from Europe. There was no meaningful U.S. nursery practice in the era. So everything arrived by ship. We have been able to find the original shipping manifests of what was sent. So we know what specimens were used, approximately what size, what species, and all those things. Has been very helpful.
How about the bridge? One that by the lake.
That, I should not try to sound like I know more than I really do about that bridge, except to say that it was not part of the original plan. It was, as the campus grew towards College Road, that became a meaningful pedestrian connection. So it was a good addition, probably not part of the original concept.
What's being planned right now for this area between the PSMS building and Rowland Hall where you have it all cordoned off?
Oh, I wish I'd brought you a plan.
I wish you had too.
We have a very generous gift to establish what we think will be the philosophical heart of the university there. You know, I visit a lot of campuses as a planner, and what I know about campuses that are well planned is that even as a neophyte, you can walk into that campus and you can ultimately find your way around to that focal point, which is really the heart, the philosophical heart of the institution. The UR is a little confusing that way, mostly because of the partisan relationship between some of the elements. But we've been moving in that direction, and the concept for Judson Hall is intended to, very intentionally, to replicate Crams' intention that that the library would come out and probably again turn 90 degrees and begin to enclose an English academic quadrangle out there. And Judson Hall serves in that same function, and the quadrangle itself will be quite magnificent. This very generous gift that I mentioned is going to allow us to do a lot of brick and stone work, a lot of nice landscape specimens out there, and we're now working on the design of a couple of special things, you know, to sort of give it some spiritual significance. But what we hope is then when the casual visitor comes to campus and they wander around and they ask themselves, does this place have a center? When they find that, they'll know that that's it.
What's the time frame on getting that?
Well, there are those who think that I'm leaving the university in anticipation of not being able to complete this building by August 1st. But that is not the case. The building will be occupied, completely occupied in early August, and essentially all those details will be ready for the dedication ceremony in September. We just finally picked the final brick pavers and some stone colors and some things just yesterday morning, so we can start construction. It's good. It's going to be a place. It's going to be highly featured with teak benches and a lot of things. That's going to make it a place for the students to hang out. For some of you to hang out, we hope, on your lunch hour. We have some real expectations. It's going to be programmatically the big sister to the little quadrangle in Richmond, Maryland, Puryear Hall with a fountain in it. It's going to be that level of quality expanded to fill that whole area.
Getting back to the landscaping, Lynn Dickerson, was it last summer or summer before, took us on a tree tour of campus.
Mm-hmm.
He's interested in, in
Right.
trees. And he made the comment that in the past, an acquaintance of his who's with VPI said that it was a shame that the tree planting had not been consistent through the years because trees do get old and die.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if there's if there's any plan to
Mm-hmm.
improve on that situation.
There is. There was some of you know Steve Glass, who is our staff horticulturist and who's the superintendent of the landscape department. During a period of months, when he was walking around campus with a clipboard, some of his staff folks thought that he was actually spying on them and keeping track of what they were doing. What he was doing was he was inventorying all the trees on the property, if you can believe that. It was a laborious process. He inventoried them all as to size, to species, to health. We predicted their fatality at some point and committed this all to a piece of software which he and one of our other staff folks was instrumental in developing, and which may become the model for tree inventory in some other institutions. But we're beginning, this computer program is beginning to develop for us a picture of what the campus is going to look like 20, 40, 60 years out from now, with the fatality of some of the mature species that we have. And we are using those models to determine where our tree replacement programs are going and how quick we have to get there. So that today we are planting 150% of the amount, somewhere between 150 and 200% of our loss every year. In other words, for every 2 trees we lose, we plant 3. No, for every 2 trees we lose, we plant 5. Anticipating that there'll be some early fatality among those. But the types of those trees that we plant and the location for them are based all on this modeling that's been done with the current tree inventory. Anything more? Paul?
Yeah, where are you going and what kinds of challenges
Yeah.
are going to be facing you in the future?
Well, there'll be a lot of challenges that don't exist at UR because the means are not so ample where I'm going. But there is a group of institutions in Michigan which are collectively called Cranbrook, or the Cranbrook institutions. They consist of the Cranbrook Institute of Science, which is a large museum property, a lot like our Virginia Science Museum, but where some postdoctoral research also occurs. The Cranbrook Academy of Art is a graduate school for artists and architects. The Cranbrook Schools is a 4-campus K through 12 prep school program. And then the Cranbrook House and Gardens Museum is based on the 1904 mansion designed by Albert Kahn and the Associated English Gardens. And these were conceived at one point as separate institutions on one massive property with separate entrances on the periphery. And over the years, the philosophy has changed, and they have become more and more centrally administered until they have finally engaged their first central vice president for operations and administration, and that's me. The significant part of this, artistically for me, is that, and the reputation of this institution rests primarily on the fact that in 1925, the person who was essentially the patron of this institution attracted the architect Eliel Saarinen to come to the property and to live, and to spend essentially the next 30 years of his life developing those buildings that constitute these institutions. Eliel Saarinen is a name that is somewhat known. Eero Saarinen, his son, also grew up on the property, began his architectural practice in collaboration with his father, and was also very influential in the development of the institution. So, besides some mundane administrative responsibilities, that responsibility that I'm feeling most keenly in connection with my new assignment is a preservation and advancement of Saarinen's work, at what was his personal masterpiece, clearly.
Where is this?
This is outside Detroit, between Detroit and Flint, Michigan. And the other aspect of the situation, which is somewhat intriguing, is that the elder Saarinen died at his home on the property. We're lucky to have a home which is behind Saarinen's own home on the campus. And he died there in 1951. And the patron with whom he had worked collaboratively to develop the property over these 30 years died the next year. And they were 2 very titanic personalities, if you will. And there was nobody to step forward in their places during the early 50s. And as a consequence, the institution has built very little for 40 years. They are so daunted by the traditions that they have architecturally that the last significant, I was telling Judith yesterday, the last significant thing they built was an auditorium, and they put it underground. Rather than try to compete with their own legacy. Well, after 40 years of pent-up need, they are about to embark on some major new facilities. This museum is going to be expanded in a meaningful way. There's going to be new studios for the architecture school where Saarinen was president. There's going to be development of an early childhood center, which is essentially school for 3, 4, and 5-year-olds at the lower school campus. Some new athletic facilities for the upper school campus, and a new entrance, which is currently the focus of an international design competition. Well, what they have done is they have broken away from the intimidation of the past. They have decided that their precedent is a search for new architectural form, and have engaged for these 5 projects, 5 internationally renowned architects, including Rafael Romeo, who recently retired as the architectural dean at Harvard and gone back to his practice in Barcelona. And we're looking forward to working very closely with him on his home turf. But they have decided that it's time that they have emboldened themselves finally to step out of this position they've been in and to build 5 new projects, which are intended to reach out and touch the parameters of architectural thinking and architectural practice today. And the prospect of being the central person representing that institution in that process was irresistible to me.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.